The year was 1879, and the dust on the road into the town of Dry Willow didn't rise in clouds. It hung in the air like a shroud, a fine, gritty powder that coated everything in a layer of weary brown. The late afternoon sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the parched earth and bleaching the sky to a pale, washed-out blue. A hot, oppressive wind blew from the south, a furnace breath that offered no relief, only a dry, baking heat that cracked a man's lips and made the sweat on his brow feel like a thin layer of grit. It was the kind of heat that made tempers short and memories long. Colehart felt it in every bone. He sat atop the buckboard of his wagon, the reins held loosely in his calloused hands. His horse, a sturdy bay named Beau, plodding along with the patient resignation of an animal that knew its work. The wagon bed was loaded with heavy sacks of salt and tightly coiled lengths of rope from the trading post downriver, supplies that were the lifeblood of his modest ranch. With every lurch and sway of the wagon, the worn leather of his saddle creaked a familiar complaint. The edge of it chafed against his side, right over the place where an old scar lay ridged and pale against his sun-darkened skin. It was a dull ache, a ghost of a pain that always seemed to whisper a little louder in this suffocating heat. He shifted his weight, a small, unconscious movement to ease the friction, his jaw tight. The road dipped toward a low wooden bridge that spanned the mostly dry bed of Cotton Draw Creek. Up ahead, a shape resolved itself out of the shimmering heat haze. It was a hired coach, one of the shabby, overworked conveyances that ferried hopefuls and runaways between the bigger towns and these smaller pockets of civilization. But it wasn't moving. It was canted at a strange, drunken angle, one of its rear wheels looking like a broken limb. Standing beside it, a solitary figure, was a woman. She was wrapped in a simple gray cloak, the hood drawn up despite the sweltering temperature, as if to ward off the sun or the world itself. She stumbled slightly, a hand going out to the side of the coach to steady herself. Beside her on the ground sat a single valise, its leather peeling at the corners, its clasps dull and tarnished. It looked as tired and worn as she did. Cole pulled Beau to a halt a dozen yards from the bridge. The silence that settled was thick, broken only by the buzz of insects and the sighing of the wind through the sparse cottonwoods that lined the creek bed. He watched for a moment, his gaze narrowed. A broken-down coach wasn't an uncommon sight, but there was no driver fussing over the wheel, no other passengers milling about in complaint. There was only the woman, the dust, and the oppressive quiet. He swung a long leg over the side of the buckboard, his boots landing with a soft thud in the thick dust. He didn't hurry. In this country, haste was often a mistake. He walked toward the bridge, his steps measured, his eyes taking in the whole scene. The problem was clear enough. The linchpin on the axle had sheared clean off, and the heavy wheel had slid part way from its mount before the entire carriage had lurched, its frame now resting precariously close to the edge of the narrow bridge. A few more inches and the whole thing would have toppled into the rocky creek bed below. It was a bad spot to be stranded. As he drew closer, the woman looked up. He couldn't see much of her face beneath the shadow of her hood, just a pale chin and a mouth set in a firm, tired line. She clutched the handle of her battered valise as if it were an anchor. "Problem?" Cole's voice was rough from disuse, raspy with the road dust he'd been breathing all day. She gave a small, jerky nod, her gaze darting from him to the crippled coach and back again. "The pin broke," she said, her voice soft, little more than a whisper against the wind. "The driver, he took my fare and said he was going into town for help. He took his horse and he hasn't come back." Cole's eyes scanned the dust around the coach. The tracks of a single horse heading toward Dry Willow were plain enough, but they were already blurred by the wind. They were hours old. The driver wasn't coming back. He'd taken her money and left her to her fate, a common enough cruelty in a land that had little time for the unfortunate. He didn't say any of that. He just nodded, his gaze returning to the wheel. "It's sitting on the axle. We need to lift the carriage to get it back on." The woman looked at the heavy coach, then at him, a flicker of despair in her eyes. "I can't," It's too heavy. Cole walked to the back of the coach, testing its weight. It was heavy, but not impossible. He was strong, his muscles hardened by years of ranch work, of wrestling steers and heaving hay bales. He looked around, his practical gaze settling on a large, flat rock by the creek bed. He could use it as a chalk. "I'll lift," he said, the words clipped and final. "You guide the wheel back onto the axle when there's enough room." He positioned himself, bending low and fitting his shoulder under the heavy wooden shaft of the undercarriage. The wood was rough, splintered, digging into the fabric of his shirt and the muscle beneath. He planted his feet, getting his leverage, the muscles in his back and legs coiling like thick rope. He took a deep breath, the hot, dusty air searing his lungs. The woman moved to the wheel, her hands hovering uncertainly near the iron-rimmed wood. She leaned in close, her hood falling back slightly. From this angle, he could see a strand of dark hair stuck to her sweat-sheened temple. She was younger than he'd first thought. She smelled faintly of lavender and exhaustion. As he braced himself to take the strain, she spoke again, her voice so low he almost didn't hear it over the groaning of the wood and the ever-present wind. "You don't even know my name," she whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, laced with a strange mix of wonder and weariness, as if kindness from a stranger was a concept she no longer understood. Cole grunted, putting his strength into the lift. The carriage groaned in protest, rising an inch, then two. The pressure on his shoulder was immense, a crushing weight that made his teeth grind together. "Don't need to help," he bit out. The words squeezed from his lungs. "Now, the wheel!" His words seemed to break her paralysis. She moved quickly, her hands surprisingly steady, guiding the heavy wheel. It scraped against the wooden axle, a jarring, grating sound. "A little more," she urged, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. Cole gave a final, desperate heave. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. The carriage lifted just enough. With a loud thud, the wheel slid back into place. "It's on!" she cried. He let the weight down slowly, his muscles screaming, until the carriage settled with a shudder. He stepped back, rolling his shoulder, the spot where the beam had rested already aching. He walked to the side of the road, found a sturdy, thick branch, and with a few deft strokes of the knife from his belt, fashioned a crude but effective replacement for the pin. He hammered it into place with the flat of his hand. It would hold as far as town. While he worked, from the center of Dry Willow, less than half a mile away, unseen eyes were watching. Inside the cool, dim interior of the Red Dog Saloon, a man named Silas pushed aside the grimy, yellowed curtain of the front window. He squinted against the glare. "Well, look at that," he said to the room at large, which consisted of two other listless drinkers and the bartender. "Looks like Cole Hart's found himself some company." Another man, a grizzled prospector named Abe, swirled the dregs of his whiskey. A woman, alone, by a broke-down coach. He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Stranger." Silas let the curtain fall back into place, plunging the room back into shadow. "Trouble follows them," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Always does." Back on the bridge, the makeshift repair was done. Cole stood up, wiping his sweaty hands on his dusty jeans. The woman had pulled her hood back up, her face once more a mystery in the shadows. She stood with her hand resting on her valise, her knuckles white. She wasn't looking at him, but scanning the dusty road, the low, sun-baked buildings of the town, the empty plains stretching out beyond. She looked like a cornered animal, like something being hunted. Then her eyes met his. In the brief, unguarded moment, he saw the fear plain as day. It was a deep, bone-weary fear. But as she looked at him, something in her expression shifted, for a single, suspended heartbeat. The hunted look in her eyes softened, replaced by a flicker of something he couldn't name. It wasn't trust, not yet. It was more like a moment of quiet recognition, a brief, silent acknowledgement of the simple, decent thing he had done. It was a shared stillness in a world that felt anything but still. The moment passed. She looked away, her hand tightening on the handle of her luggage. "Thank you," she said, her voice formal now, distant. "It'll get you to town," Cole said, gesturing toward the carriage. "The blacksmith can make a proper pin." He turned and walked back to his own wagon without another word. He climbed back onto the seat, the old leather groaning under his weight. He took the reins, but he didn't urge Beau forward just yet. He watched in his peripheral vision as she climbed into the rickety coach, her movements stiff and tired. The coachman's horse was gone, but the two horses hitched to the carriage itself were still there, dozing in the heat. She would have to lead them. The wind shifted then, a sudden gust that whipped dust into the air and carried with it a new scent. It was the smell of distant rain, the clean, earthy promise of ozone and wet ground. A storm was building somewhere out on the plains, a dark mass of clouds gathering on the far horizon. But the wind that carried the promise of rain also carried whispers. The men in the saloon had already begun to talk. By the time the woman in the gray cloak led the limping coach into the single dusty street of Dry Willow, a story would have already taken shape, woven from suspicion and boredom. In a town like Dry Willow, a rumor could take root and grow faster than any weed, long before the first drop of water ever hit the ground. Dry Willow operated on a rhythm of dust and debt, a slow, grinding beat that everyone knew by heart. Cole Hart felt that rhythm in the thinning stack of receipts threaded onto the nail behind Mr. Abernathy's counter at the general store. He unloaded the sacks of salt, stacking them neatly in the storeroom, the air thick with the scent of dried beans, cured tobacco, and oiled leather. Abernathy, a man whose spine had curved to match the stoop of his shoulders over his ledger. "Tallied the delivery. That clears the credit for the wire and the flour last month." "Cole," he said, his pencil scratching on the paper, "leaves you a little over for this rope." He looked up, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose. "Not much, though." "Enough is enough," Cole replied, his voice flat. He didn't need the reminder. His land was his, free and clear, but the ranch ran on a thin margin. A sick calf, a dry spell, a broken axle, any one of them could tip the scale. His father had left him the land, but he'd also left him a habit of stubborn independence that didn't always square with the numbers in a ledger. He took the small chit of paper Abernathy handed him and folded it into his pocket. The bell over the door jingled, and the thick sunlight from the street was momentarily blocked by a large frame. Wade Pritchard stepped inside, bringing a chill with him that had nothing to do with the shade. Pritchard owned the Dry Willow Bank, which meant he owned a piece of nearly everyone and everything in town. He was dressed in a dark, well-tailored suit that seemed to repel the dust, his boots polished to a high shine. He smiled, a precise, practiced movement of the lips that never reached his eyes. His eyes were the color of a winter sky over a frozen lake, pale, clear, and cold. "Hart," Pritchard said, his voice smooth as a worn river stone. "Good to see you in town. Hope your herd is faring well in this heat." "They're managing," Cole said, giving a short nod. He disliked Pritchard with a quiet, steady intensity. It wasn't just the man's wealth or power. It was the way he looked at people, as if he were constantly calculating their value, their weaknesses, the exact pressure point where they would break. Pritchard's cold gaze flickered over Cole's dusty clothes before settling back on his face. "The bank is always here to help our neighbors through the lean times. Just remember that." The smile remained, but the words hung in the air like a veiled threat. It was a reminder of the power he held, the specter of debt that haunted every rancher and shopkeeper. Cole didn't reply. He just picked up a small tin of saddle soap he'd set on the counter and placed a coin beside it. He nodded once more to Abernathy and walked out, the bell jingling his departure. He could feel Pritchard's eyes on his back all the way to the door. While Cole navigated the currents of commerce and unspoken animosity, the woman in the gray cloak found a different kind of harbor. She had led the tired horses and the damaged coach to the blacksmith, paid the man from a small, worn purse for the repair, and then, with her scuffed valise in hand, had walked not to the saloon or the boarding house, but to the whitewashed church that stood at the edge of town. Its steeple was the tallest thing in Dry Willow, a simple wooden cross against the vast, empty sky. Reverend Barclay met her at the door. He was a kind man, his face a roadmap of worry lines etched by listening to the troubles of his flock. He saw the exhaustion in her posture, the fear that still clung to her like a second cloak. He listened patiently as she spoke, her voice low and hesitant. She did not give him a name. She told him only that she had been traveling a long way and was looking for a place to teach, a place where she could be of service. She had heard there was no school in Dry Willow. The town did have a small room attached to the church that served as a makeshift schoolhouse, but it had been empty for nearly a year since the last teacher had married a prospector and moved on. Reverend Barclay, seeing a potential answer to his prayers and a soul clearly in need of sanctuary, offered her the small, clean room at the back of the parsonage, a place usually reserved for visiting clergy. "It's not much," he said, leading her through the cool, quiet church, their footsteps echoing in the empty space. "But it is safe and quiet. You can stay as long as you need to find your footing." "Thank you, Reverend," she whispered, her shoulders slumping in a wave of relief so profound it was almost painful to watch. "You are very kind." She kept to herself, staying inside the parsonage, avoiding the curious glances that followed the Reverend whenever he crossed the street. The town knew a stranger was staying with him, and in Dry Willow, a stranger without a story was a blank page on which everyone felt free to write. A few days later, Cole was at the town well, a stone-lined circle in the center of the main square that served as the primary source of water for most of the townsfolk. Bo was drinking deeply from the trough, and Cole was working the hand pump, filling the barrels in the back of his wagon. The sun was high, the heat relentless. He heard a soft footstep on the packed earth behind him and turned. It was her, the woman from the bridge. She had shed the heavy gray cloak, and in the harsh light of day, he saw her more clearly. She was dressed in a simple, practical dress of dark blue cotton, her dark hair pulled back neatly at the nape of her neck. She was slender, and her face, though pale and drawn, had a quiet strength in its fine bones. Her eyes, he noticed, were a deep, clear gray, the color of a dove's wing. She held something out to him. It was a small square of folded linen, a man's handkerchief, slightly grimy and creased. "This is yours," she said. Her voice was still soft, but steadier now than it had been on the bridge. "You used it to cushion your shoulder when you lifted the coach." Cole had forgotten all about it. He had grabbed the first thing he could find in his pocket to put between his shoulder and the splintered wood. He looked at the handkerchief, then at her. "Keep it," he said. "It's just a rag." "No," she insisted quietly. "A kindness should be returned." He took it from her, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. Her skin was cool. He stuffed the handkerchief back into his pocket without another word, an awkward silence falling between them. He turned back to the pump, the rhythmic squeak and clank filling the space. Just then, a small group of children, let out from their afternoon chores, came running into the square, their bare feet kicking up dust. They stopped when they saw the strange woman, their boisterous games falling silent as they stared with undisguised curiosity. One of them, a little girl with bright red pigtails named Sarah, took a hesitant step forward. "Reverend Barclay says you might be our new teacher," she said, her voice a mix of awe and challenge. The woman's expression softened, the guarded look in her eyes melting away as she looked at the child. A small, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time. She knelt, bringing herself down to their level. "I would like that very much," she said. "Do you like to read?" The children crowded closer, their initial shyness forgotten. As she spoke to them, she pushed a stray strand of hair from her face, the movement pulling the sleeve of her dress up slightly. In that brief moment, against the pale skin of her inner wrist, Cole saw it a faint, discolored mark, a shadow of a bruise in the shape of fingers. It was old, fading, but it was unmistakably there. He looked away, his jaw tightening. He finished filling his last barrel, the noise of the pump seeming unnaturally loud. Inside the Red Dog Saloon, the whispers had found fertile ground. The mid-afternoon lull was in full effect, the air thick with the smell of stale beer and cheap whiskey. Staying with the preacher, Silas mused, polishing a glass with a dirty rag, puts on a good show of it. I'll give her that. I heard tell she's from up north. Abe, the prospector, chimed in, leaning forward on the bar. Maybe she's one of the Hollow Creek gang's women? They scattered after that last bank job in Silver Creek. Maybe she's laying low, waiting for them. Or maybe she's a runaway wife, offered another man from a corner table. Husband probably got tired of her ways and she lit out before he could take a strap to her. Could be bait, Silas said. His eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Sent ahead to soften the town up. Make us think she's a helpless schoolmarm before the rest of her kind rides in. The theories multiplied, each one darker and more sordid than the last. They were just words, idle speculation to pass a hot afternoon, but they were taking on a life of their own, hardening into a truth that had nothing to do with the quiet woman talking to children by the well. Cole secured the barrels in his wagon, his movements economical and precise. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where she came from or what had left that mark on her wrist. The questions were there, coiled in the back of his mind, but he pushed them down. It wasn't his business. People out here had their reasons for starting over, for keeping their pasts locked away. To ask was to trespass. He climbed onto the buckboard, the leather of the seat hot from the sun. He gave a slight nod in her direction, a gesture of parting she didn't see, as she was now completely engrossed with the children, her face animated as she answered their endless questions. He drove the wagon out of town, the familiar weight of solitude settling back over him. But this time, it felt different. The silence in his head was filled with the memory of her cool fingers brushing his, the image of a fading bruise, the sound of her soft voice. It was an unfamiliar disturbance, a strange and unsettling sensation, like the feeling of cool, clear water seeping into the cracks of a sun-baked stone. It didn't belong. Yet there it was, a hint of something new in the parched landscape of his life. He spent the rest of the afternoon mending the split seam on his old saddle, his hands moving with the practiced skill of long habit. But his mind wasn't on the leather and thread. He thought of the whispers he knew were slithering through the saloon, the easy cruelty of men with nothing better to do than tear down a stranger. He felt a rising anger, followed by a surprising and fierce protectiveness. On the western horizon, the clouds that had been a distant smudge that morning were now a towering bank of bruised purple and gray. They were building, stacking up, their dark bellies heavy with the promise of a long overdue storm. The air grew still and heavy with anticipation. The town of Dry Willow held its breath, waiting for the rain, waiting for the trouble that everyone seemed to agree was coming right along with it. That night, the heat refused to break. It clung to the wooden walls of Cole's small ranch house, a stifling blanket woven with the scent of pine, dust, and old sorrows. He sat at his kitchen table, the light from a single kerosene lamp casting long, dancing shadows. He was shirtless, and the lamplight slicked the sweat on his shoulders and chest. He wasn't looking at the worn accounts book open before him, but at his own reflection in the dark window pane. His gaze was fixed on the scar on his side, a puckered, silvery slash just above his hip. It wasn't the pain of the wound he remembered. It was the sound, the roar of the thunder. So loud it felt like the sky was splitting apart, and the sickening crack that had followed a sound that was not thunder. He touched the scar, his fingertips tracing its familiar, ugly path. The memory rose, unbidden and sharp as broken glass. It had been a year ago, almost to the day. A storm, much like the one now gathering on the horizon, had descended on the plains. Rain came down in blinding sheets, turning the dry creek beds into churning brown torrents. In the chaos, rustlers had hit the lower pasture, cutting out a half-dozen of their best calves. His brother, Jed, had seen the lantern flicker from the house. Jed was all fire and impulse where Cole was earth and caution. He had grabbed his rifle and was out the door before Cole could get his boots on, shouting about teaching them a lesson. "Jed, wait!" Cole had yelled, pulling on his coat. "Wait for the rain to let up. We can't track them in this. By then, they'll be halfway to the next county," Jed had shot back, his face a mask of fury in a flash of lightning. "They're my calves. Cole, are you staying or coming?" Cole had gone, of course. He'd followed his brother out into the maelstrom, the wind tearing at them, the mud sucking at their horses' hooves. The guilt began there, in that first moment of hesitation. He should have stopped him. He should have grabbed his arm, knocked him down if he had to. Anything to keep him from riding out into that black, violent night. He was the older brother. He was supposed to be the steady one. They had pushed their horses hard, chasing the faint, bobbing light of the rustler's lantern. They were gaining, closing the distance as they neared Scorpion Draw, a narrow, treacherous canyon with sheer rock walls. "We've got them pinned," Jed had yelled, his voice triumphant over the wind. "They can't get through the pass in this weather." But Cole had felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his gut. The ground was slick, treacherous. The lightning was a constant, blinding strobe, playing tricks on the eyes. "It's too dangerous. Jed, let the calves go. It's not worth it." His words were swallowed by a deafening clap of thunder. Jed either didn't hear or didn't care. He spurred his horse onward, right toward the canyon's edge. And that's when it happened. A bolt of lightning struck the rim of the canyon, a blinding, searing fork of white-hot energy. Jed's horse screamed and reared, its eyes wide with terror. For a horrifying second, horse and rider were silhouetted against the flash, a perfect, terrible statue. Then the ground, already saturated and unstable, gave way. Cole had watched, frozen, as a section of the cliff edge sheared off, taking his brother and his horse with it. The sickening crack he remembered was not the lightning, but the sound of Jed's body hitting the rocks below. He had scrambled down in the dark, slipping and sliding in the mud, calling his brother's name until his voice was raw. But the only answer was the relentless drumming of the rain. The wound in his side, a gash from a sharp rock in his desperate descent, was nothing compared to the one that had been torn open inside him. The guilt was a poison. It wasn't the storm or the rustlers that killed Jed. It was his own failure. He should have stopped him. He should have been faster. He should have chosen better. The scar was just the mark it had left on the outside, miles away, in the quiet back room of the parsonage. The woman sat on the edge of a narrow cot. The same oppressive heat filled her small room, made worse by the window she kept firmly shut and latched. Her battered valise lay open before her. Its contents were meager, a testament to a life hastily abandoned or ruthlessly stripped down to its barest essentials. There were 2 children's primers, their covers softened with use. There was a change of dress, as plain and practical as the one she wore. And there was a letter, written on thin, creased paper in a delicate, looping hand. It was unfinished, the ink ending in a slight, feathery blot, as if the writer had been interrupted mid-thought. "My dearest," it began, "you must not follow. The path I have chosen is perilous, but it is the only one left to me. If you receive this, know that." The sentence was left hanging, a silent testament to a story she carried with her. Beneath the folded letter lay the final object. It was wrapped in an oilcloth, and she unfolded it with careful, reverent movements. A small, 5-shot revolver, its metal finish worn smooth in places, its wooden grip dark with age. It was not a weapon of aggression, but of defense. It was small enough to be concealed in a handbag or the pocket of a coat. She picked it up, its weight familiar but unwelcome in her palm. With a small bottle of gun oil and a clean patch of cloth, she began the methodical task of cleaning it. Her movements were precise, practiced. As she worked, her thumb brushed against the base of the grip, where 2 small initials had been carved into the wood, E.B. Her hand trembled, a sudden, violent tremor that she quickly stilled by gripping the weapon tighter. She stared at the initials, her gray eyes dark with a sorrow so profound it seemed to steal the very air from the room. This was not just a tool for protection. It was a relic, a memory, a burden she could not set down. The next morning, at the Dry Willow Bank, Wade Pritchard sat at his massive oak desk. The very picture of prosperity and control. The accounts ledger for the county was open before him. He was a man who understood that true power in the West wasn't in the speed of a man's draw, but in the columns of a ledger. He ran his finger down a page, the nail neatly trimmed and clean. It stopped at the name Hart, Cole. The debt was not substantial, a loan taken out the previous spring for seed and new breeding stock. The payments had been steady, if not always prompt. His clerk, a nervous young man named Peterson, stood waiting. "The Hart account," Pritchard said, not looking up. "The final payment for the season is due after the hay harvest, is it not?" "Yes, sir," Peterson squeaked. "End of the month." Pritchard tapped the page. "His brother's passing set him back. He was late on the spring payment. I was lenient." He finally looked up, his cold eyes fixing on the clerk. "There will be no more leniency. The railroad is surveying a new spur line through the South Valley. The Hart property, particularly its water rights from the draw, would become significantly more valuable if it were to change hands. See to it that if Mr. Hart is a single day late with his payment, you begin the foreclosure proceedings immediately. Is that clear?" "Yes, Mr. Pritchard, perfectly clear," Peterson stammered, already backing away. Wade Pritchard smiled his thin, bloodless smile and turned back to his numbers. As dusk settled, a chorus of coyotes began their nightly song, their yips and howls echoing across the plains. In her room, the woman flinched at the sound. It was a wild, lonely sound, and to her ears, it sounded like a hunt. She rose from her cot and walked to the door, her hand resting on the simple wooden bolt. She slid it into place, the sound a dull thud in the quiet room. She stood there for a long moment, her head bowed, listening. Then, as if unconvinced of her own safety, she reached out and checked it again, pushing against the door to make sure it was truly secure. Out on his land, Cole was working late, replacing a rotten post on the far section of his fence line, the part that bordered the low pasture. The light was fading fast, the landscape painted in shades of purple and gray. As he dug the new post hole, his shovel struck something that wasn't rock. He knelt, scraping away the dirt. It was a hoofprint, deep and clear in a patch of damp earth. It was from a shod horse, and the shoe had a distinctive nick in one side. It wasn't his horse, Bo, nor was it from Jed's old mare that he kept in the pasture. He stood, his eyes scanning the vast, empty landscape. He followed the tracks for a dozen yards. They came from the direction of the road, cut across the corner of his property, and disappeared into the rocky terrain heading south. They were fresh. Someone had been out here, watching. The following afternoon, in the small schoolroom attached to the church, the woman stood before a group of a dozen children. She had found her purpose here, however temporary. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a patient warmth as she guided a young boy's hand, helping him form the letters C on the small slate blackboard. She had written a single word in neat block letters, name. "This word," she said, her voice soft but clear, "is one of the most important words you will ever learn. A name is how we are known. It tells the world who we are." Sarah, the little girl with the pigtails, raised her hand, waving it eagerly. "Yes, Sarah. What's your name?" the girl asked, her voice piping and clear, filled with the simple, direct curiosity of a child. The schoolroom fell silent. The other children all turned to look at her, their eyes wide and expectant. For a split second, the woman's composure faltered. A flicker of something akin to panic crossed her face, her breath catching in her throat. The question, so innocent, was a sharp jab at the very heart of her secret. She felt the weight of the small revolver, hidden away in her valise. She thought of the unfinished letter, of the initials on the grip. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the fear was gone, tucked away behind a gentle, practiced smile. "That's a very good question," she said, her voice smooth again. "But for now, you can all just call me teacher." She turned back to the blackboard, deftly changing the subject, but the question hung in the air, unanswered. Outside, the wind began to blow in earnest. It was no longer a hot, dry breath, but a cool, damp gust that carried the heavy, electric smell of water. It rattled the windows of the church and sent dust devils dancing down the main street. The sky was no longer just bruised. It was a churning mass of dark, angry clouds. The storm was no longer coming. It was here. Dry Willow, and everyone in it, was about to break. The first drops of rain were not a relief. They were a warning. They fell fat and heavy, spattering into the thick dust and leaving dark, coin-sized circles that were quickly consumed by others. A low rumble in the distance became a steady, menacing growl. And then, with a sudden, violent gust of wind, the sky ripped open. It was not a rain. It was a deluge. Water fell in blinding silver sheets, a relentless drumming that hammered the tin roofs of Dry Willow and turned the single street into a river of churning brown mud. The world dissolved into a gray, roaring chaos. Out at the Hart Ranch, the storm hit with the force of a physical blow. Cole was in the barn, securing the shutters, when he heard it, a sound that cut through the roar of the storm, a high-pitched, panicked bleating that spoke of pure animal terror. His calves. He threw the barn door open and ran out into the downpour, the cold, hard pellets of rain stinging his face and soaking him to the skin in seconds. The creek, the lazy trickle that gave Dry Willow its name, was no longer a creek. It had swollen into a roaring, muddy torrent, and it had breached its banks, pouring into the lower pasture where he kept the small calf pen. The water was already swirling around the calves' legs, rising with alarming speed. They were huddled together on the highest patch of ground, their eyes wide with fear, their cries thin and desperate against the thunder. The pen's gate, the only way out to higher ground, was on the low side, and the rising water was already halfway up its wooden planks. A curse ripped from his throat. He plunged into the churning water, the ice-cold shock of it taking his breath away. It was already past his knees, the current strong and treacherous, pulling at his legs and trying to sweep him off his feet. He reached the gate and shoved his shoulder against it. It didn't budge. The swollen wood was jammed tight in its frame. He put his hands on the latch, a heavy iron bar, and his fingers found only splintered wood. The latch was gone. The pin that held it sheared clean off. The gate was held shut only by the sheer pressure of the water and the swollen wood. The calves were thrashing in panic now, one of the smaller ones losing its footing and being momentarily swept away before scrambling back to the small, shrinking island of mud. There was no more time. Cole braced himself, planting his feet deep in the sucking mud, and drove his shoulder into the upper crossbeam of the gate. He grunted, every muscle in his back and shoulders screaming in protest against the unyielding wood and the immense weight of the floodwater. The wood groaned, but it held fast. He slammed into it again. His teeth gritted so hard his jaw ached, a raw, animal sound of pure effort tearing from his lungs. Nothing. It was then that he saw her. A figure, a ghost in the gray downpour, running from the direction of the house. It was the woman from the church. She was soaked, her dark dress clinging to her, her hair a wild, dark tangle plastered to her head and face. In her hands, she clutched a thick coil of rope. She didn't hesitate at the edge of the water, but plunged in after him, her face set in a mask of grim determination. She didn't shout. Her voice would have been lost in the storm. When she reached him, she grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. She pointed emphatically, first at his shoulder, pressed high on the gate, and then lower, to the sturdy beam just above the waterline. She jabbed her finger downward again and again, her eyes wide and urgent. Get lower. Use the water as a counterweight, not an enemy. Leverage. He saw the simple, brutal logic of it instantly. He didn't question it. He took a gasping breath and submerged himself further into the frigid, murky water, positioning his shoulder under the lower beam. The pressure was immense, the water trying to crush him against the gate. He could feel the debris in the current scraping against his back. He looked up and saw her loop the rope she carried through a gap in the fence and around a thick, sturdy post, pulling it taut. She was creating an anchor, a handhold for him. She threw the end of the rope to him, and he grabbed it, his knuckles white. "Ready?" Her eyes asked the question. He gave a sharp, determined nod. Together, they strained. She pulled back on the fence, her slight frame trembling with the effort, trying to ease the pressure on the frame. Cole gathered all his strength, all his frustration, all his fear for his animals, and channeled it into one explosive push. He roared, a raw, guttural sound that was part fury and part pain. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a great, groaning shriek of tortured wood, the gate moved, an inch, then another. The pressure of the water behind it suddenly became an ally, helping to force it open. A torrent of brown water surged through the opening. Cole held his ground, his muscles screaming, pushing the gate wider and wider until the gap was big enough. The terrified calves, seeing their chance, scrambled through, swimming and stumbling toward the safety of the higher ground beyond the pen. The last calf was clear. Cole let go, his body slumping against the fence, his lungs burning, his strength utterly spent. She released her hold on the fence, her own body sagging with relief. It was in that moment of exhausted triumph that the sky exploded. A blinding, searing flash of lightning struck a tall cottonwood tree not 50 yards away, and the crack of thunder was instantaneous and deafening. It was not a rumble. It was a physical concussion, a solid wall of sound that slammed into them. The world went white and silent for a heartbeat. Instinctively, they both stumbled back from the fence, away from the flash. They collided, and the force of the impact, combined with their exhaustion, sent them falling against the rough plank wall of the pen. Cole managed to twist, taking the brunt of the impact against his back and side, his arm instinctively wrapping around her to shield her. They lay there for a second, tangled together against the wood, the storm raging around them. His breath came in ragged, burning gasps, hers in short, shaky shivers. He could feel the frantic, frightened hammering of her heart against his ribs. The rain poured over them, a cold, cleansing sheet. A cloud of their mingled breath rose in the cold air between them. He slowly pushed himself up, helping her sit. They didn't speak. There were no words for what had just happened, for the shared terror and the violent, elemental effort that had bound them together. They were just two people, soaked and shivering, their bodies humming with adrenaline, huddled against a wooden wall in the heart of a storm. In the flickering, uncertain light, he could see her face more clearly than he ever had before. The rain had washed it clean and had plastered strands of dark hair to her cheeks and forehead. Her gray eyes, wide and luminous in the gloom, were fixed on his. He could see the pulse beating a frantic rhythm in the hollow of her throat. She was the one who broke the silence, her voice a raw whisper, barely audible above the rain. "You don't know my name," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, filled with a deep, aching vulnerability. It was the whisper of a woman who had given everything she had to a stranger, who had faced down a force of nature alongside him, all without the simple armor of a name. Cole looked at her, at the strength he had just witnessed, at the courage that had sent her running into a flood to help him. He thought of the whispers in the saloon, the ugly, baseless stories. They were nothing. This was real. This was the truth of her. He raised a hand, his fingers calloused and cold from the rain. He saw her flinch almost imperceptibly, a defensive reflex that spoke of a past he couldn't imagine. He hesitated, then moved his hand with deliberate slowness. He didn't touch her lips. He gently, almost reverently, laid his fingertips against her forehead, just below the hairline. "Don't need to," he answered, his voice low and rough with emotion. To know this courage, to know this strength, to know this person." They didn't kiss. The space between them was more charged than any kiss. It was filled with the roar of the storm and the silent, deafening beat of their own hearts. They stayed there, kneeling in the mud and the rain, their eyes locked, communicating in a language older and more honest than words. It was a moment of profound recognition. A silent pact forged in chaos and sealed with a touch as gentle as the storm was violent. But they were not alone. Beyond the newly secured fence line, where the shadows of the outbuildings bled into the gray sheet of the rain, a lone figure stood half hidden by the corner of the smokehouse. He was a shape made darker by the rain. A watcher, still and patient. He was not seeking shelter from the downpour. He was observing, watching the gate, the cabs, the man and the woman. He stood for a long moment, a silent, menacing sentinel, before melting back into the deeper shadows, his presence unseen, his purpose unknown. Back in Dry Willow, the Red Dog Saloon was crowded, the storm having driven every lonely soul in town to seek its dim, smoky comfort. The story, as it always did, had arrived before the players. Heard the preacher's little schoolmarm ran out to Hart's place the second the rain started. Silas, the bartender, said, a knowing smirk on his face as he poured a whiskey. Abe, the prospector, let out a greasy chuckle. Can't imagine she was helping him with the livestock. A woman like that, all quiet and proper, she's got a fire in her. I'll wager Cole Hart's just the man to find the flint. The men around the bar laughed, a hollow, empty sound that was swallowed by the next clap of thunder. They drank their whiskey and spun their tales, twisting an act of desperate courage into something cheap and sordid. Outside, the rain washed the world clean, but inside the saloon, the filth was just settling in. The morning after the storm was unnervingly clean. The rain had scoured the air, and the sky was a high, polished blue. The world smelled of wet earth and pine, a fresh, raw scent of new beginnings. But for Cole Hart, it was a morning for endings. He stood in the lower pasture, the rising sun warming his back, and looked at the ruin of his calf pen gate. The wood was splintered, the frame warped. It was a morning of repairs, of costs he couldn't afford. He knelt in the soft mud, his practical eyes assessing the damage. The main crossbeam was cracked, and the hinge post was loose in the waterlogged ground, but it was the latch that held his attention. He had assumed in the chaos of the storm that the pin had simply broken under the strain. Now, in the clear light of day, he saw the truth. The wood around the iron housing hadn't splintered from pressure. It had been cut. The edges were too clean, too straight. It was the work of a saw. He ran his thumb over the cut, and it came away smeared with a thick, gritty mud. He frowned, rubbing the paste between his fingers. It was a deep, rich red, the color of brick dust or old blood. He looked around. The soil of his ranch, the earth that clung to his own boots, was a dark, loamy brown. This red clay, it didn't belong here. It was foreign. He stood slowly, his mind turning over the image of the sawn wood, the memory of the strange hoof prints he'd seen before the storm, the convenient timing of the failed gate right as the floodwaters hit. This wasn't bad luck. It was sabotage. He carried the broken piece of the latch mechanism back to the house. She was on the porch, a broom in her hand, sweeping away the leaves and debris the storm had left behind. She looked up as he approached, a question in her gray eyes. She had stayed, insisting on helping with the cleanup, her presence a quiet, steady counterpoint to the chaos of the morning. Without a word, Cole held out the piece of wood. "This mud," he said, his voice low and tight. "It's not from my land." She took the splintered wood from him, her gaze falling on the smear of red clay. She turned it over in her hands, her brow furrowed in concentration. For a long moment, she was silent, her mind clearly sifting through memories. A flicker of recognition, distant and uncertain, crossed her face. "When I first traveled through this territory," she began, her voice hesitant, as if pulling a memory from a deep, dark well. Our guide spoke of the local gangs. He mentioned Hollow Creek. He said they used to use an old, abandoned clay pit south of here as a hideout. The walls were steep, the color of rust, and there was only one way in or out. Cole's blood ran cold. Hollow Creek. He knew the name, a vicious band of rustlers and thieves. The guide said the pit, and all the land around it was eventually bought up, she continued, her eyes meeting his, by a man from Dry Willow who wanted the mineral rights, Wade Pritchard. The name hung in the air between them, heavy and cold as a tombstone. Pritchard, the man with the dead eyes and the polished boots, the man who held the note on nearly every soul in town, including Cole. Suddenly, the puzzle pieces began to snap into place with a sickening clarity. The strange hoof prints, the sawn latch, the storm. It was a calculated attack designed to cripple him, to make him miss his payment, designed to make him fail. The next few days were a quiet, tense dance of discovery. In the small schoolroom, the woman did not teach arithmetic or spelling. She taught geography. "Today," she announced to the dozen children seated before her, "we are going to make a map. Not a map from a book, but our map. A map of Dry Willow." She gave them each a piece of rough paper and a charcoal nub. "I want you to draw the places you know best, the path you take to the creek to fish, the shortcut through the woods to your friend's house, the place where the best berries grow." The children, delighted by the task, set to work with a chaotic enthusiasm. They drew crooked lines for roads, lopsided squares for houses, and scribbled circles for the woods. They were children's drawings, naive and out of proportion, but they held a truth that no surveyor's map ever could. They held the town's secrets. They showed the forgotten trails, the deer runs, the shortcuts that only children and men who didn't want to be seen would use. That evening, under the low light of a single lamp, she and Cole laid the disparate pieces of paper on his kitchen table. Slowly, patiently, she began to piece them together, matching a bend in a creek on one drawing to a distinctive stand of cottonwoods on another. The crude drawings coalesced into a single, living document, and there it was, a thin, faint line, drawn by a young boy who liked to track rabbits, leading from the main road, skirting the edge of the Hart property, and heading directly south. It was a hunter's trail, a rustler's path, and it led straight toward the area marked with a child's scrawl, "Mr. Pritchard's Red Dirt Pit." Cole stared at the map, a cold, hard knot tightening in his stomach. The evidence was there, drawn in charcoal by the innocent hands of children. But it pointed to a man who was untouchable. "We can't," he said, his voice rough. He pushed himself away from the table, the ghost of his brother's fall whispering in his ear. "If we involve Wade, we lose everything. He'll call in my note. He'll ruin us with a word. He owns the law in this town." She looked up from the map, her gray eyes steady and unflinching. She did not argue. She did not try to persuade him. She simply stated the truth, her voice quiet but clear as a bell in the silent room. "If we don't," she said, "we lose it slower." Her words hit him harder than any physical blow. She was right. Pritchard's game wasn't just about this one payment. It was a slow, deliberate strangulation. To do nothing was to consent to his own destruction. He looked at her, at the quiet resolve in her face, and felt a surge of something that shamed his own fear. It was the moment he stopped seeing her as a victim to be protected and started seeing her as a partner. "The warehouse," he said, his voice now firm. "Behind the bank. It's where he keeps his mining equipment and supplies. If they used his tools, they might still be there." They went after dusk, moving through the back alleys of Dry Willow like shadows. The air was cool, smelling of wood smoke and the lingering damp from the storm. The warehouse was a squat, windowless building that sagged in the middle, its door secured by a heavy iron padlock. It was a lock Cole knew, a standard brand, easily picked by a man who had spent his life working with machinery. With a piece of wire from his pocket and a few tense, silent moments of manipulation, the lock clicked open. They slipped inside, pulling the heavy door shut behind them. The air was stale and thick with the smell of dust, old grease, and something else, a faint, sharp scent of kerosene. The only light came from the thin sliver under the door and the dim moonlight that filtered through the warped boards of the roof. They moved slowly, their eyes adjusting to the gloom. The warehouse was a cluttered graveyard of abandoned projects and forgotten supplies. Rusted tools, broken wagon wheels, barrels of black powder for the mines. Cole moved toward a workbench cluttered with tools. He ran his hand over the teeth of a large crosscut saw. They were sharp. He moved on. She was the one who found it. Tucked away in a dark corner, half hidden under a pile of canvas tarps, was a smaller, one-man bucksaw. Cole picked it up. The blade was dull, its teeth worn. He ran his fingers along the flat of the blade, and they came away with a faint, reddish grit. Near the saw, coiled on the floor like a sleeping snake, was a length of coarse twine. It was the kind used for tying down loads or baling hay. Caught in its rough fibers were the same brick-red filaments of clay. They used the twine to wrap the handle for a better grip in the rain. Cole whispered, his mind reconstructing the scene. Behind a stack of empty crates, he found the final piece, a small, leather-bound ledger, just like the one Abernathy kept at the general store. He carried it to the door, tilting it to catch the sliver of moonlight. Most of the pages were blank, but near the back, there were a few recent entries, written in a precise, neat hand that Cole recognized as belonging to Peterson, Pritchard's clerk. The entries were simple, almost innocuous. Supplies for night patrol, wages for S&A, bonus for completed task. There were no names, only initials, but the dates corresponded perfectly with the days leading up to the storm. It was a thread, thin but undeniable, connecting the sabotage at his ranch directly to the bank. Suddenly, a sound from the street split the night air, the deep, resonant tolling of the church bell, calling the faithful to the evening service. The sound was a comfort to most, a rhythm of town life. To Cole and the woman, it was a death knell. Footsteps crunched on the gravel outside, heavy, confident footsteps. The door of the warehouse creaked open, flooding the space with the yellow light of a lantern. Wade Pritchard stood silhouetted in the doorway, the ledger still in Cole's hands. He wasn't surprised. He didn't raise his voice. He simply smiled, that cold, precise smile that held no warmth, no humor, only a chilling certainty of his own power. Working late, Hart, he said, his voice smooth as silk. He stepped inside, his eyes taking in the scene, Cole holding the ledger, the woman standing a few feet behind him, her face pale in the lantern light. His gaze lingered on the book in Cole's hands. Auditing my accounts for me, I appreciate the diligence. He took another step closer, his presence seeming to suck the very air from the small building. Your debt comes due at the end of the month, he said, his voice dropping slightly, the pretense of civility gone. I trust there will be no complications in settling the matter. His eyes flickered to the saw, the twine, then back to Cole's face. The threat was unspoken, but absolute. Then, his cold gaze shifted, moving past Cole to fix on the woman. He looked at her as if she were a stray dog that had wandered onto his property, an object of mild, dismissive curiosity. And you, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. I don't believe we've been introduced. Who are you? The question was a weapon, aimed at her anonymity, the one shield she had left. Cole felt a protective urge to step in front of her, to answer for her, but she didn't need him to. She stood her ground, her chin held high. Her voice, when she spoke, was perfectly even, without a trace of the fear that was surely churning inside her. The teacher, she said. It was a simple answer, but it was a claim to a place, a purpose, a refusal to be erased. As she spoke, her right hand, which had been hanging at her side, slipped discreetly into the pocket of her dress. Her fingers closed around the cool, smooth wooden grip of the small revolver hidden there, a silent promise that while her name might be a secret, she was not without a voice. The confrontation in the warehouse left a residue in the air, a silence thicker and more menacing than the darkness outside. Pritchard had not made a move, content to let his power and the ticking clock of Cole's debt do his work for him. They had walked away, the unspoken threats hanging between them like smoke. For 2 days, an unnatural quiet settled over Dry Willow. It was the calm at the heart of a storm, a stillness where every rustle of leaves sounded like a footstep. Every shadow seemed to hold a man. The rumor started on the 3rd night, a whisper that traveled from the saloon to the general store and back again, gaining momentum with each telling. The Hollow Creek gang was back in the territory. A shepherd out on the South Range had seen 3 riders, hard men with rifles across their saddles, moving fast under the cover of dusk. The news spread like a prairie fire, igniting the low-grade fear that was a constant companion in these parts. At the Hart Ranch, the cattle knew it first. They were restless, lowing uneasily in the lower pasture, their dark shapes shifting and milling in the moonlight. It was not the placid contentment of a herd settling for the night. It was the nervous, edgy energy of animals that smelled a predator on the wind. Cole stood on his porch, a rifle cradled in his arm, his eyes scanning the dark, rolling hills that bordered his property. He had seen this before. He knew what it meant. "They're pushing them," he said, his voice a low growl. "Trying to spook them, make them break the fence line so they can drive them off in the confusion." The woman appeared in the doorway behind him, a silhouette against the warm lamplight of the house. She held a lantern, its flame casting a small, brave circle of light onto the porch. "It's Pritchard's men," she said. It wasn't a question. "He's not going to wait for the note to come due," Cole said, his jaw tight. "He's going to manufacture a disaster, then offer to help me out of it by buying my land for pennies on the dollar." He looked toward the south in the direction of the rickety wooden bridge that spanned Cotton Draw. "If they're going to drive a herd, they'll have to cross the draw. It's the only way to get them into the broken country before morning." He turned. His decision made, "Stay here. Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone." "No," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. She stepped out onto the porch, placing the lantern on the railing. "You're 1 man. They are 3. You'll need another pair of eyes. This isn't a broken wagon wheel. There will be guns." "I am aware," she said, and her hand went briefly to the pocket of her dress. "I am not asking for your permission." He looked at her for a long, hard moment in the moonlight. He saw no fear in her eyes, only a fierce, resolute calm that mirrored his own. Arguing would be a waste of time he didn't have. He nodded once, a sharp, curt gesture. Bo was already saddled. He swung up, then reached down a hand for her. She took it, and he pulled her up behind him, her arms wrapping around his waist for balance. She was light, but her presence was a solid, grounding weight against his back. He dug his heels into Bo's flanks, and the horse surged forward, its powerful legs eating up the dark ground as they raced toward Cotton Draw. The ride was a frantic, breathless rush through a world of silver and black. The moon was high and bright, casting sharp, clear shadows that played tricks on the eyes. Every rock looked like a crouching man. Every gust of wind sounded like a pursuing horse. He could feel her breath against his neck, her hands clutching his shirt as they galloped across the open range. They moved as one, a single, desperate entity propelled forward by the urgent, thundering rhythm of the horse's hooves. They saw the bridge from a low rise. It was a stark, skeletal shape against the star-dusted sky. And just as he had feared, 3 figures on horseback were waiting on the far side, blocking the path. They were motionless, patient as vultures. The trap was set. Cole slowed Bo to a walk, pulling him into the deep shadow of a rocky outcropping. "They're waiting for me," he whispered, his voice a harsh rasp. "They think I'll come charging in after my herd." "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady, close to his ear. He looked at the bridge, his mind racing, assessing the terrain, the angles, the enemy. The bridge was old, a narrow span of wooden planks suspended by thick rope anchors tied to massive posts on either bank. He had helped his father repair it after a flash flood years ago. He knew its weaknesses. He knew its bones. "They have the high ground and the numbers," he said. "We can't fight them head on. We have to change the ground." He slid off Bo's back, handing her the reins and the lantern she had insisted on bringing. "When I move, you create a distraction. Something bright, something to draw their fire. Then get yourself into the rocks and stay down." She just nodded, her eyes wide and dark in the moonlight, trusting him completely. He moved low and fast, a shadow among shadows, circling around to the creek bed that ran beneath the bridge. The water was shallow, barely ankle deep, gurgling softly over the smooth stones. It was colder than he expected. He reached the massive post on his side of the bank. Above him, he could hear the low murmur of the men's voices, the creak of saddle leather. He pulled the heavy Bowie knife from the sheath on his belt. The blade gleamed dully in the moonlight. He took a deep breath, and then he yelled, a wild, defiant cry that echoed off the canyon walls. "Get off my land!" The response was immediate. The crack of a rifle shot split the night, the bullet thudding into the thick post just inches from his head, sending a shower of splinters into his face. That was her cue. From the outcropping, the lantern suddenly soared through the air, a fiery arc of light tumbling toward the men on the bridge. For a moment, it seemed to hang in the air, a tiny, man-made star. The men, startled, turned toward the light, their attention diverted for a precious second. Another shot rang out, this one aimed at the lantern, shattering the glass and extinguishing the flame. But it was enough. While their eyes were adjusting from the flash, Cole was already working, his knife sawing frantically at the thick, taut rope anchor. The fibers were tough, resistant, but his blade was sharp and his arms were strong. The rope groaned, strands snapping with a sound like pistol shots. One by one, they gave way, until with a final, violent jerk, the main anchor rope tore free. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. The entire left side of the bridge, deprived of its support, sagged violently downward. The wooden planks tilted at a steep, treacherous angle. One of the men, caught completely by surprise, let out a yell as his horse lost its footing on the slanted planks, stumbling and sliding toward the edge. Another man's horse reared in panic, its hooves clattering wildly on the wood. The ambush had dissolved into chaos. Cole didn't wait to see the result. He was already scrambling up the rocky bank, using the cover of the confusion to get back to the bridge. He emerged onto the now slanted surface just as one of the men was dismounting, his face a mask of fury. The man lunged, a long-bladed knife in his hand. Cole sidestepped, letting the man's momentum carry him past, and brought the heavy pommel of his own knife down hard on the man's wrist. The man grunted in pain, his knife clattering onto the planks. As Cole turned, he saw her. She hadn't stayed in the rocks. She was near the end of the bridge, and the third man had her by the arm. But she wasn't panicking. As the man was distracted by the collapse of the bridge, she drove the hard heel of her boot down onto his instep with all her strength. He howled in pain and surprise, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She wrenched her arm free and kicked his leg from under him, sending him sprawling. Cole was already moving toward her when the second man, the one whose horse had stumbled, came at him. This one was big, a bear of a man, and he didn't bother with knives. He simply charged, his powerful arms reaching for Cole. Cole met him head-on, but the man's sheer size and momentum were too much. They crashed together, and the world became a blur of flailing limbs and grunts of pain. They struggled on the tilting bridge, a desperate, clumsy dance of violence. The man's powerful hands found Cole's throat, squeezing, cutting off his air. Black spots exploded behind Cole's eyes. The sound of the gurgling creek faded, replaced by a roaring in his ears. The man's snarling face swam before him, and for a terrifying, paralyzing moment, it wasn't the man's face he saw. It was the face of the storm. He was back on the cliff edge, the lightning flashing, the thunder cracking, the ground giving way beneath his brother. He could feel the fall, the sickening lurch of gravity, the crushing weight of his own failure. He was frozen, his muscles locked, his past rising up to choke him more effectively than the man's hands ever could. Cole, her voice. It cut through the fog of memory like a knife. It was sharp, clear, and filled with a desperate urgency. "Look at me!" He blinked, and the ghost of the storm was gone. He saw her, her face pale in the moonlight, her eyes wide with fear not for herself, but for him. She was here, now. This was not the past. This was a fight he could still win. A surge of pure, primal adrenaline coursed through him, burning away the paralysis. With a guttural roar, he twisted his hips, using his body's leverage to break the man's grip. As the man stumbled backward, momentarily off balance, Cole drew the Colt from his holster. He didn't have time to aim, to fire. He simply reversed the pistol and brought the heavy steel barrel around in a vicious arc, striking the man squarely on the side of the head. The impact was a dull, sickening thud. The man's eyes rolled back in his head, and he crumpled without a sound, his limp body sliding off the edge of the tilted bridge and landing with a heavy splash in the shallow water below. Silence descended, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the sound of their own ragged, desperate breathing. The first man Cole had disarmed was gone, having scrambled off into the darkness. The one she had kicked was nursing his leg, already backing away, his appetite for the fight gone. He melted into the night after his partner. They were alone on the broken bridge. Cole stood there, his chest heaving, the Colt still clutched in his hand. He looked at the man in the water, then at her. She was staring at him, her hand pressed to her mouth. He stumbled over to where the man had fallen and knelt, his hands moving quickly, professionally. He wasn't checking for a pulse. He was searching the man's pockets. His fingers closed around a small, soft leather pouch. He pulled it out. It was heavy with coins, but that wasn't what he was looking for. Tucked inside was a folded piece of paper. He opened it. It was a receipt, a payment voucher for services rendered. At the bottom, in a familiar, precise script, was the signature he had expected to see Wade Pritchard. Below the signature was the embossed stamp of the Pritchard Company. Bank. He had it. The proof. He slowly climbed to his feet and walked back to her. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He stood before her on the ruined bridge, the damning piece of paper in one hand, the cold steel of his pistol in the other. They were both shaking. Not from cold, but from the violent aftermath of adrenaline. They made their way off the bridge to the solid ground of the creek bank. He sank to his knees, the fight and the fear leaving him feeling hollowed out and weak. She knelt beside him, her shoulder brushing against his. He could smell the scent of her, a mix of lavender, rain, and the sharp, metallic tang of gunpowder. He leaned his head forward until his forehead rested against hers. He closed his eyes. They stayed like that for a long time. Two exhausted figures under the vast, indifferent sky, their heads bowed together. He could feel the warmth of her skin against his, the soft puff of her breath. Sweat trickled down his temples, tasting of salt and grit. It was a taste more real, more potent than any rain. It was the taste of survival. The dawn that followed the fight on the bridge was cold and gray. The world washed clean and stripped of its shadows. There was no victory in the air, only the heavy, metallic tang of what comes next. Cole had retrieved the unconscious man from the creek, tying him securely in his own barn. He was a hired hand from a ranch 2 counties over, a man with a weak will and a strong thirst. Easily bought. The other 2 were gone, melted back into the wilderness they had come from. But the proof, the small leather pouch with its damning voucher, sat on Cole's kitchen table, a weight heavier than any bag of coin. They didn't speak of the fight, they didn't speak of the fear, or the moment he had frozen, or the way her voice had pulled him back from the edge. The unspoken understanding was a raw, living thing between them. After he had tended to Bo, he walked with her back to town, the leather pouch and Pritchard's ledger from the warehouse tucked inside a canvas bag. They walked not to the sheriff, a man known to enjoy Pritchard's expensive cigars, but to the one place in Dry Willow that professed to answer to a higher authority, the church. Reverend Barkley listened, his face etched with a gravity that went beyond his usual pastoral concern. They sat in his small, book-lined study, the scent of old paper and beeswax in the air. Cole laid out the evidence on the Reverend's desk, the sawn piece of the gate latch with its telltale red clay, the ledger with its coded payments for a night patrol, and finally, the payment voucher signed by Wade Pritchard, taken from the pocket of a man who had tried to kill him. The Reverend steepled his fingers, his gaze moving from the objects on his desk to Cole's grim face, and then to the quiet, watchful woman beside him. This is a grave accusation. Cole, he said, his voice low. Wade Pritchard is a pillar of this community. His word, his signature on a banknote, is the foundation of our commerce. His signature is also on a payment to an ambusher, Cole said, his voice flat and hard as granite. His greed is the foundation of a crime. I'm not asking you to be a judge, Reverend. I'm asking you to be a witness. Let the town see the evidence. Let them be the jury. It was a radical proposition. Dry Willow had a circuit judge who passed through twice a year to handle official business. In between, justice was a rough, often arbitrary thing. But what Cole was asking for was something different, a trial of public opinion, a moral reckoning in a place that had no room for legal subtleties. Reverend Barkley was silent for a long time. He looked at the woman, at the quiet strength in her face, a strength he had seen grow since the day she arrived. He looked at the evidence, a clear, ugly line connecting the town's most powerful man to violence and deceit. He sighed, a sound of profound weariness. The house of God is a house of truth, he said. Finally. Ring the bell. The sound of the church bell tolling on a weekday morning was an alarm. It was a sound reserved for fires, for warnings, for news of such importance that it could not wait for Sunday. People emerged from their homes and businesses, their face etched with curiosity and concern. They saw Cole Hart standing on the church steps, his face set like stone, and they saw the teacher beside him, her expression unreadable. One by one, they filed into the church, their work boots scuffing on the wooden floor, their whispers a low hum that filled the vaulted space. Mr. Abernathy from the general store, Silas from the saloon, farmers in from their fields, their wives with them. They filled the hard wooden pews, a silent, expectant audience. Wade Pritchard arrived last. He did not scurry in the back but walked straight down the central aisle, his polished boots clicking with an arrogant rhythm. He was dressed impeccably, a dark suit in a sea of homespun cotton and denim. He looked neither left nor right, his cold gaze fixed on the altar, where Reverend Barkley now stood behind a simple wooden lectern. He took a seat in the front pew, alone, the very picture of offended dignity. The hearing, for no one knew what else to call it, began. There was no gavel, only the Reverend clearing his throat to bring a hush to the room. He explained, in simple terms, that Cole Hart had brought a serious charge against Wade Pritchard, and that, in the absence of a judge, it was right for the community to hear the matter plainly. Cole stepped forward. He did not stand at the lectern, but in the open space before the altar, on the same level as his neighbors. He placed the evidence on a small table. He held up the sawn piece of wood. "This is from my gate," he said, his voice clear and steady, carrying to the back of the church. "It was cut just before the storm that nearly wiped out my calves. You can see the red clay. It's not the soil of my land." He then held up the ledger. "This is from Mr. Pritchard's warehouse. It lists payments to a night patrol for a completed task on the night my gate was cut." Finally, he held up the leather pouch and the signed voucher. "And this," he said, his voice dropping, "I took from the pocket of a man Mr. Pritchard paid to ambush me at the Cotton Draw Bridge last night, a man who was hired to make sure I never made it to the end of the month to pay my debt." A wave of murmurs swept through the church. Eyes shifted from Cole to Pritchard. Wade, however, did not flinch. He rose slowly to his feet, a look of mild amusement on his face. "Reverend, townspeople," he began, his voice smooth and reasonable. "This is a fantastic story, a desperate tale from a desperate man on the verge of losing his family legacy." He gestured dismissively at the table. "A piece of wood, a ledger that proves only that I take precautions to protect my property, and a receipt I sign dozens of such vouchers a week for honest work. It proves nothing, except that this man," he pointed a finger at Cole, "is not above assault and robbery to try and shift the blame for his own failures." He smiled his cold, confident smile. "My papers, the legal, binding documents in my bank, tell the true story, the story of a debt, legally acquired and legally due, Everything else is just the noise of a failing man." His words were potent. He spoke of law, of paper, of order. Cole had only spoken of violence and mud. The tide of opinion in the room began to shift. People looked at the floor, at their hands. Debt was a language they all understood. It was real. Cole's story was beginning to sound wild, unproven. Reverend Barkley looked troubled. "The evidence is circumstantial. Cole, it is your word against his." He turned to the woman, who had remained standing silently beside the front pew. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gentle, "you were with Mr. Hart. You are a witness to these events. For the record I must keep. I will need your name." The question dropped into the silent church like a stone into a deep well. Every eye turned to her. This was the moment she had been dreading. The moment her carefully constructed anonymity would be shattered. Cole saw the flicker of panic in her eyes, the way her hand tightened into a fist at her side. He saw her take a small, almost imperceptible step backward. He couldn't let Pritchard do this to her, use her past, whatever it was, to destroy her here and now. He stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of her. "Her testimony stands on its own," he said, his voice a low growl directed at the Reverend. "If you need a signature for your records, she can sign it Teacher." A ripple of confused whispers went through the pews. Silas, from the saloon, let out a short, derisive laugh that he quickly stifled. Wade Pritchard saw his opening, and he pounced. "Teacher," he boomed, his voice dripping with scorn. "How convenient. A witness with no name." He turned to face the crowd, his arms spread wide. "Friends, neighbors. The law, the very foundation of our society, is built on names, on identity, on accountability. How can we accept the word of a person who will not even tell us who she is? A nameless person's word is worthless. It is a ghost's word. For all we know, she is a confederate of the Hollow Creek Gang herself, a plant, a liar. The accusation was brutal, and it landed with devastating effect. The murmurs grew louder, more suspicious. She was a stranger, an unknown. Pritchard was right. Who was she? Cole felt a surge of white-hot rage. He started to move toward Pritchard, but a hand on his arm stopped him. It was hers. She stepped out from behind him, her face pale but her spine straight as a gun barrel. She looked not at the crowd, but directly at Wade Pritchard, her gray eyes clear and cold as a winter morning. She took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it was so clear, so filled with a quiet, unshakable conviction, that it cut through all the noise and silenced the entire church. "My name," she said, her gaze unwavering, "is not what is on trial here today. It is not needed for justice. The truth is—" She took a step forward, her presence suddenly commanding. "The truth is in the red clay on that wood. The truth is in the numbers in that ledger. The truth is that this man," she pointed a steady finger at Pritchard, "tried to ruin another man for profit. That truth does not change, no matter what I am called." The silence that followed was absolute. She had not answered the question, but she had rendered it irrelevant. She had appealed to something higher than the law of names and papers, the simple, stark law of right and wrong. Reverend Barkley looked from her to Wade, and then out at the faces of his congregation. He was a man of faith, not of law, but he was a man who understood the weight of truth. "I cannot declare guilt here today," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority. "But I have seen enough to declare a doubt." He looked directly at Wade Pritchard. "I am granting a stay. The foreclosure on the Hart property is suspended. We will send for the circuit judge. We will give him this evidence, and we will have a proper investigation. 3 days. That should be long enough for a rider to reach him and for the truth to find its own voice." It was a stunning pronouncement, a victory, however temporary. Pritchard's face, for the first time, lost its composure. A flicker of pure, unadulterated fury crossed his features before he masked it with a sneer. He turned on his heel without another word and stormed out of the church, the heavy doors banging shut behind him. The tension in the church broke. People began to talk, to stand, to stretch. The hearing was over. Cole felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He had won a reprieve, but the war was far from over. He and the woman walked out onto the church porch, into the cool afternoon air. The breeze carried the clean, sweet scent of rain-soaked wood and damp earth. They stood by the railing, not speaking, watching as the townspeople slowly dispersed, talking in low, urgent clumps. She leaned against a post, her shoulders finally slumping, the iron control she had maintained inside finally giving way. She let out a long, shaky breath. "You still don't know my name?" she whispered, her voice so soft he barely heard it. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of wonder, of a truth that had somehow survived the public crucible they had just endured. He had defended her, stood by her, all without knowing the first thing about her. Cole turned to face her, the afternoon sun, breaking through the clouds, caught in her dark hair. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the vulnerability she had kept so carefully hidden. He thought of her running through the flood, of her fierce cry on the bridge, of her unshakable voice in the church. He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hand, his thumb stroking her cheek. He leaned down, and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of passion, or of triumph. It was achingly light, a soft, hesitant pressure that was over almost as soon as it began. It was a kiss of profound gratitude, of silent understanding. It was a promise. He pulled back, his eyes searching hers. "I know who you are," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. The kiss was a fleeting thing, short and chaste as a prayer, but it felt more binding than any signature, more permanent than any word written in ink. It was an agreement signed in the quiet aftermath, a treaty between two embattled souls who had found their common ground. The 3 days that Reverend Barkley had decreed were a long, slow turning of the screw. Dry Willow held its breath. The town was a split log, with a clear line drawn down its center. On one side were those who depended on Wade Pritchard's goodwill shopkeepers with credit, ranchers with mortgages. They walked with their eyes downcast, offering Cole tight, nervous smiles before hurrying on their way. On the other side were the men with less to lose, men who had long chafed under Pritchard's thumb, who saw in Cole's stand a reflection of their own silent frustrations. They would nod at Cole in the street, a hard, respectful gesture that said more than words ever could. The whispers in the Red Dog Saloon died whenever Cole walked in for a beer. The gossip at the general store turned to talk of the weather when the teacher entered to buy flour. They were a unit now in the town's mind, their fates entwined. The silence that surrounded them was not a void. It was a heavy, charged thing, filled with judgment, fear, and a grudging respect. On the second day, a man came to the church. He was one of the miners who worked Pritchard's small, unproductive claim at the red clay pit. His name was Jebediah, a man with dust in the lines of his face and a permanent weariness in his stooped shoulders. He asked to see the Reverend, and they were closeted in the study for over an hour. When Jebediah emerged, he looked as if a great weight had been lifted from him, though his eyes were haunted. The bell tolled again on the morning of the third day. This time, there was no surprise. The whole town came. The church was packed so tightly that men stood 3 deep in the back, their hats clutched in their hands. They were not here for a hearing. They were here for a verdict. Wade Pritchard again took his seat in the front pew, his face a mask of ironclad confidence. He believed in the power of paper, in the sanctity of a signature on a loan document. He believed that in the end, fear would always win out over truth. Reverend Barkley stood at the lectern, his Bible open, but his eyes on his flock. 2 days ago, he began, his voice calm and steady. We were presented with a story. Today, we are presented with a confession. He nodded toward the side door, and Jebediah the miner shuffled forward, his worn work boots making no sound on the wooden floor. He stood before the altar, twisting his hat in his hands, his gaze fixed on the floorboards. "Jebediah," the Reverend prompted gently, "tell them what you told me." The miner took a shuddering breath. "It was me," he said, his voice a low, gravelly mumble. "Me and Silas from the saloon. And another fella, Pritchard, Mr. Pritchard paid us. He finally looked up, his haunted eyes sweeping over the silent crowd. He called us his night patrol, said Hart was a risk to the bank's investment. Said we was just protecting the assets. He swallowed hard. He gave us the saw from his warehouse. He told us to cut the latch pin on the calf gate. He knew the storm was coming. He said the flood would do the rest, make it look like an act of God. He said if Hart's herd was spooked, if he lost a few head, he wouldn't be able to make the final payment. The bank would get the land. Clean. The confession hung in the stuffy air of the church. A simple, ugly truth. Wade Pritchard did not move, did not speak. A faint, contemptuous smile played on his lips. It was the word of a hired drunk against his own. But the Reverend wasn't finished. He unrolled the crude map the children had made. He pointed to the faint charcoal line that depicted the hunter's trail. "Jebediah," he asked, "is this the path you took to the Hart Ranch?" The miner squinted at the paper. "Aye, Reverend, that's the one. Comes out of the south end of the clay pit. Follows the ridge. Keeps you off the main road." The map, an innocent school project, had become a sworn affidavit. The Reverend then produced the ledger from the warehouse. The ledger lists payments to S and A. Would that be Silas? And the other man? "Aye," Jebediah mumbled. "Silas and Abe." Finally, the Reverend held up the voucher Cole had taken from the man at the bridge. "And this payment, for services rendered, signed by Mr. Pritchard." "That was for the other job," Jebediah whispered, his face ashen. "For stopping Hart if he got too close to the truth." The chain of evidence was complete. The whispers in the church were no longer hushed. They were a low, angry growl. The foundation of paper and fear that Pritchard had built his empire on was crumbling. Wade rose to his feet, his movement slow and deliberate. The smile was gone, replaced by a look of cold fury. "This is an outrage," he said, his voice ringing with indignation. "A conspiracy of debtors and drunkards. Of course I take measures to protect the bank's property. The Hart Ranch is a bank asset until the loan is repaid. My actions were nothing more than prudent financial oversight. Prudence does not involve a saw in the dead of night. Wade," Reverend Barkley said, his voice stern, shedding the role of gentle pastor and assuming that of a righteous judge. "You cannot protect your property by destroying another man's." Cornered, his rationalization stripped away, Wade turned his venom on what he saw as the weakest link. He pointed a trembling finger at the woman, who stood beside Cole, her face pale but her expression resolute. He spat, his voice laced with venom. "The catalyst for all of this, the nameless phantom who appears from nowhere and brings this trouble with her. How do we know she isn't the real threat? How do we know she isn't bait, sent by the Hollow Creek gang to sow chaos in this town before they ride in and pick our bones clean?" He had played his last card, the card of fear and suspicion. He was trying to turn the town's fear of the unknown against her, but he had misjudged her. He had mistaken her silence for weakness. She stepped forward, her movement drawing every eye. She stood alone in the space before the altar, directly in front of Pritchard. The fear was still in her eyes, a deep, old shadow, but it was overshadowed now by a fire that burned away all the lies, all the pretense. She raised her head, and her clear, steady voice filled the silent church. "My name," she said, each word a carefully placed stone, "is Eliza Byrne." A collective gasp went through the crowd. A few of the older townspeople looked at each other, a flicker of recognition in their eyes. The name Byrne was not unknown in Dry Willow. Eliza's gaze never left Wade Pritchard's face. She was trembling, a fine, barely controlled tremor, but her voice was strong. "I am the sister of Thomas Byrne." The gasp this time was louder, a wave of understanding and shock that rippled through the pews. Thomas Byrne, a young farmer who had owned the small plot of land bordering Pritchard's South Range, a man who had died the previous year. "My brother was a good man," Eliza said, her voice thick with the grief she had held in for too long. "He was a good farmer, but he had water on his land, and Mr. Pritchard wanted it. So Mr. Pritchard fabricated a debt. He produced papers, signed and sealed, for a loan my brother never took. He bankrupted him. He ruined him." She took another step closer to Wade, whose face had gone chalk white. "When my brother protested, when he swore to expose the fraud, Mr. Pritchard had him arrested, accused him of being a threat, a madman." Her voice broke, but she forced the words out. "My brother died on the road to the federal marshal's office. They said he tried to escape. He died in chains, for a debt that never existed, for a crime he did not commit." The story fell into the silent church, a truth more terrible than any rumor. It explained everything: her secrecy, her fear, her presence in Dry Willow. She was not a runaway or a drifter. She was an avenger, seeking not blood, but justice. The town had its verdict. It was written on the faces of the farmers and the shopkeepers, a silent, unified condemnation. They looked at Wade Pritchard not as a pillar of their community, but as a predator who had fed on them for years. Reverend Barkley raised his hand for silence. "Wade Pritchard," he said, his voice ringing with the authority the town had tacitly given him. "This community finds you morally culpable. By the authority vested in me by God and this congregation, I order you to make full restitution for the fraudulent debt of Thomas Byrne, to be paid to his sister. I am levying a fine against you, to be used to repair the Hart property and to establish a fund for any others you have wronged. And I am sending a full report of these proceedings, along with this testimony, to the circuit judge. This town will have a full federal investigation into the practices of your bank." It was over. Wade stood alone in the front pew, the weight of 100 pairs of eyes pressing down on him. He looked around, his gaze searching for an ally, a friendly face, and finding none. He had built his world on fear, and now, with the fear gone, he had nothing left. He turned and walked down the aisle, his confident stride gone, replaced by the shuffle of a defeated man. The crowd parted for him, a silent, damning corridor. As the doors closed behind him, a collective breath was released. The crisis had passed. In the middle of the church, Cole Hart reached out and took Eliza Byrne's hand. He didn't say a word. He just held it, his large, calloused hand enveloping hers. A simple, public declaration. He was with her. Her past was his past. Her fight was his fight. As the townspeople watched, the last of the ugly rumors, the whispers about a runaway wife or a gangster's maul, finally withered and died, like lamps running out of oil. They walked out of the church together, hand in hand, into the bright, clean sunlight. As they stood on the top step, looking out at the town that had just been reborn, Eliza began to cry. It was not the loud, racking sobs of despair, but a silent, steady weeping. Tears of grief and relief, and a year's worth of unspeakable pain finally being released. She did not hide her face. She just stood there and let the tears fall. Cole reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, folded square of linen she had returned to him at the well. It was worn and creased, no longer clean. He unfolded it and gently pressed it into her hand. Life in Dry Willow after the fall of Wade Pritchard did not erupt into celebration. There was no dancing in the street, no grand speeches. Instead, a collective sigh seemed to pass through the town, a long, slow exhalation of breath that had been held for years. The air itself felt lighter. Men stood a little straighter. The nervous sideways glances that had been a part of the town's currency were replaced by direct, open looks. Dry Willow began to breathe again. The change was a quiet, organic thing, like the first green shoots of grass pushing up through the mud after the flood. Wade Pritchard, stripped of his power and facing the cold scrutiny of a federal investigation, was a ghost in his own town. Within a week, a man in a city suit arrived on the stagecoach. There were quiet meetings in the bank, and then, just as quietly, Pritchard was gone. He sold his controlling interest in the bank, his mining claims, and the deed to his house to a consortium from Mesa Verde. He left on the same stagecoach, his back rigid, his face a mask that concealed whatever shame or fury lay beneath. No one saw him off. The bank reopened under new management, with Pritchard's nervous clerk, Peterson, promoted and instructed to be fair and transparent. The oppressive weight of debt, wielded as a weapon, was lifted. It was still there, a fact of life, but it was no longer a guillotine hanging over every transaction. Out at the Hart Ranch, life settled into a new rhythm, one dictated by work and the slow healing of the land. The seasons did not wait for men's dramas to conclude. The hay needed cutting and baling. The new calves, born in the weeks after the storm, needed tending. The scent of fresh-cut grass, sweet and clean, mingled with the earthy smell of the newborn animals, a perfume of endurance and continuity. The sky, which had seemed so low and oppressive, now felt vast and open, a clean blue canvas stretching to an endless horizon. It was during this period of quiet labor that the mail rider brought the letter. He was a wiry young man who rode through twice a month, a lifeline of news and correspondence to the isolated pockets of civilization. He handed Eliza a crisp, clean envelope, its postmark clear and official Mesa Verde. She took it with a sense of strange detachment. Mesa Verde felt like a place from another lifetime. She waited until the rider was gone before she broke the wax seal. She read the letter standing on the porch, the afternoon sun warm on her shoulders. The words were formal, respectful. They had received Reverend Barclay's glowing recommendation. Her qualifications were impeccable. The town council of Mesa Verde was pleased to offer her the position of head schoolmistress at their new, fully funded public school. The salary they offered was more than double what the small collection plate in Dry Willow could ever provide. There was a proper boarding house for teachers, a well-stocked library, a community that valued education and propriety. It was everything she had once thought she wanted. It was safety. It was respectability. It was a life where she would be known only as Miss Byrne, the teacher, her past a closed book, her name a simple fact, not a declaration of war. She read the letter a second time, and a third, the clean, black ink a stark contrast to the rough, sun-bleached wood of the porch railing she leaned against. That evening, Cole found her sitting at the kitchen table, the letter lying open before her. The lamp was unlit, and the room was filled with the soft, gray light of dusk. She wasn't reading it anymore. She was just staring at it, her face troubled. He didn't ask what it was. He could see the official letterhead, the way it represented a world far from this dusty, hand-built life. He poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove and sat down across from her, pushing one of the cups toward her. For a long time, they sat in silence, the only sound the gentle ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. He was giving her space, a quiet respect for the decision that he knew was now hers to make. "It's a good offer," she said finally, her voice low. "A real school, books, a proper salary." "Mesa Verde is a fine town," Cole said, his voice even. He took a sip of his coffee. "You'd do well there. They would be lucky to have you." There was no pleading in his voice, no hint of pressure. It was a simple, honest statement, and it somehow made the decision harder. He was making it easy for her to leave. She looked around the simple, rustic kitchen at the scrubbed pine table, the stone fireplace, the neat row of iron pots hanging by the hearth. This was a place of work, of survival. It was not a place of comfort and ease. Then she looked at him, at his strong, calloused hands wrapped around his coffee cup, at the quiet steadiness in his eyes. He followed her gaze. "It's not much," he said, a hint of apology in his tone. "It's a home," she corrected him softly. He nodded, accepting the distinction. He looked out the window, toward the old, disused stable that stood silhouetted against the deepening twilight. It was a sturdy structure, built by his father from thick, hand-hewn logs, but it had stood empty for years, a repository for old tools and forgotten things. "That old stable," he said, his voice thoughtful. "The roof is sound. The walls are good." He looked back at her, a new idea taking shape in his eyes. "We could clear it out, put in a new floor, bigger windows, build shelves along the walls." He leaned forward, his quiet intensity filling the small space between them. "It could be a library. For the children. For the whole town. We could order books with the money from Pritchard's fine." He gave a small, hesitant smile. You could choose the books. I could choose the shelf planks. It wasn't a counteroffer. It wasn't a promise of wealth or ease. It was a vision, a shared project, a future to be built together with their own two hands. It was a foundation, not of paper and ink, but of wood and sweat and shared purpose. The image was so clear, so simple, so beautiful that it made her heart ache. But with it came the fear, a cold whisper from the past she had fought so hard to escape. She had just found her name again, had declared it in a church full of people as an act of defiance and identity. She had fought to be Eliza Byrne, sister of Thomas Barne. What would she be here? Would she become just an extension of him? Her identity absorbed into his, her name once again lost in the life of another. She couldn't voice the fear directly, but he saw it in her eyes. He saw the shadow of doubt that crossed her face. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. His touch was warm, solid, grounding. He looked directly at her, his gaze holding hers, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "Eliza," he said, and the sound of her name, her real name, spoken in his low, rough voice, was more intimate than any touch had ever been. "I'm not looking for a woman to keep my house. I'm not looking for a shadow to follow me a few steps behind." He squeezed her hand gently. "I need a partner, someone to stand beside me, to build with me, not behind me." The words were the key, the one thing she needed to hear. A partner, not a possession. A companion, not a dependent. He wasn't offering to give her a life. He was asking her to build one with him. The fear that had been a cold knot in her stomach began to dissolve. The next Saturday was a day of joyous, chaotic work. Cole and Eliza, with the help of a half-dozen of the town's children, cleaned out the old stable. They swept away decades of dust and cobwebs, carried out old, rusted equipment, and threw open the heavy doors to let the bright, clean sunlight flood the dark space. The children, armed with buckets of whitewash, painted the interior walls, getting more of the white paste on themselves than on the logs, their laughter echoing in the newly emptied space. At the end of the day, Sarah, the little girl with the pigtails, proudly held up a sign they had painted on a wide, smooth plank of wood. In a wobbly, earnest script, it read, "Heartburn School Library." They hung it over the stable door, a declaration of a new beginning for the town, a partnership made public. A few days later, Eliza sat alone in Cole's kitchen in the quiet hour before dawn. A small fire crackled in the stove, warding off the morning chill. In her hands, she held the letter from Mesa Verde. She read it one last time, a farewell to a life she could have had, a path she would not take. Then, with a steady hand, she opened the small iron door of the stove. She held the letter over the flames. The corner of the paper curled, turned brown, and then caught, the fire starting as a small, clean blue line before erupting into a bright, consuming yellow. She watched until the last of the official script turned to black, weightless ash, and floated up the chimney. That night, after the chores were done and the world had settled into a deep, quiet peace, they walked together out to the fence line that Cole had spent the last week repairing. The new posts were straight and true, the wire taut. The newborn calves lay sleeping in the grass, their mothers standing watch nearby. The moon was a silver sliver in a sky littered with stars. They walked in a comfortable silence, their shoulders occasionally brushing. The air was cool and smelled of the coming autumn. He had kept his promise. He treated her as an equal, discussing the ranch's finances with her, asking her opinion on the new breeding bull, listening as she planned the curriculum for the new school. As they reached the end of the fence line, he stopped and turned to her. In the quiet of the night, with the future of their school and library standing as a solid promise behind them, he reached out and took her hand. His fingers laced through hers, a simple, solid connection. They stood there for a long time, hand in hand, looking out at the vast, sleeping land that was now together, their home. There was no need for words. Their choice had been made. The first autumn wind swept through Dry Willow, carrying the scent of dust and distant wood smoke, a clean, sharp harbinger of the coming cold. The season turned. and with it, the life of the town found a new, steadier rhythm. At the heart of this new rhythm was a sound that had been absent for too long, the bright, clear clang of a small iron bell. Every afternoon at 3 o'clock, the bell would ring from its new perch atop the old stable, and the heavy plank door of the Hartburn School library would swing open. A flock of children would burst out into the sunlight, their patched clothes a testament to the town's hardscrabble existence, but their eyes bright with a light that had not been there before. They clutched slates with chalk-dusted fingers and books with worn, softened covers, their shouts and laughter a boisterous, living music that filled the dusty street. Cole often found himself pausing his work, leaning on a fence post or the handle of a shovel, just to watch them. He would watch Eliza emerge from the schoolhouse behind them, a smudge of chalk on her cheek, her face glowing with a patient, bone-deep satisfaction that had erased the last shadows of the hunted woman he had met on the bridge. The day the sign was finished, he had insisted on hanging it himself. It was a beautiful piece of wood, a wide plank of ponderosa pine he had sanded smooth as glass. Eliza had painted the letters herself in a deep, confident blue heartburn reading shed. He climbed a ladder, the sign balanced on his shoulder, and positioned it over the doorway. He took a nail, set it, and drove it home with a single, clean blow of his hammer. He drove in the second nail, and the third, and the fourth, the sound ringing out in the clear, still air. Thump, 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 thump. It was a solid, declarative sound, not the crack of a rifle or the shriek of splintering wood, but the steady, reassuring beat of something being built to last. It sounded like a heart. One evening, as the days grew shorter and the chill of night settled in earlier, he found her sitting by the fire in the main room of his small house, which was now their house. The light of the flames danced on her face, illuminating the quiet concentration in her features. In her hands was the small, worn linen handkerchief he had given her on the steps of the church. She held a needle and a spool of dark blue thread, and she was embroidering something onto the corner of the cloth. He watched her for a long time, watched the nimble, patient movement of her fingers, the way the needle rose and fell with a steady, practiced rhythm. The stitches were small, even, and perfect. They were the stitches of a woman who was no longer in a hurry, no longer running. They were the stitches of a woman who was home. When she was finished, she bit the thread and held the handkerchief up to the firelight. In a neat, elegant script, she had stitched a single word, name. It was the ghost that had haunted her, the question that had defined her, now captured and made beautiful by her own hand. It was not a secret anymore. It was an ornament. He walked over and knelt beside her chair. He took the handkerchief from her, his calloused fingers tracing the raised letters. The simple word held the weight of their entire story. "I know your name now," he said, his voice low and rough with an emotion that still caught him by surprise. She smiled, a soft, slow smile that reached all the way to her eyes. She reached out and placed her hand on his cheek, her touch gentle and sure. "And I," she said, her voice a soft murmur that was for him alone. "I know you chose me." Life did not become a fairy tale. Out on the horizon, the dust still rose from the hooves of passing riders. The wind could still blow cold and hard across the plains, and the sky never made any promises of fairness. Winter would be lean, and summer would be hot. Trouble was a permanent resident of the territory. This was a hard land, and it made hard people. But the Hart Ranch fence line was straight and true. Its new posts sunk deep into the earth. The water in the troughs was always full and clean, a promise to the herd that grazed peacefully in the pasture. Inside the house, on the kitchen table, the accounts ledger lay open. The column of debts was shrinking, the list of assets growing with each passing season of grass, with each new calf born into the herd. These were the small, solid truths that pushed back against the harshness of the world. They were the foundations of a life. On a cool, clear evening, they stood together under the wide overhang of the reading shed, the new sign a proud declaration above their heads. The last of the children had gone home, and a profound, peaceful quiet had settled over the ranch. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in brilliant streaks of orange and purple. He turned to her in the fading light, and he drew her into his arms. He kissed her, and this kiss was not the hesitant, questioning touch on the church steps. This was a kiss of deep, settled certainty. It was longer, quieter, filled with the comfortable, easy knowledge of two people who had found their place in the world, and in each other. It was a kiss that tasted of hard work and shared hope, a promise sealed not with a whisper, but with a profound and trusting silence. There were no more hushed, desperate words passing between them. No more, "You don't even know my name." The only sounds that mattered now were the ordinary, hopeful sounds of their life together, the gentle lowing of the cattle in the dusk, the crackle of the fire in the hearth, and, in the quiet afternoons, the soft, scratching sound of chalk against a slate, as a woman named Eliza Byrne taught the children of Dry Willow how to write their own names, how to build their own futures, one careful, hopeful letter at a time. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the first lamps began to glow in the windows of the town. Dry Willow lit its lights against the coming dark. Hope, they had learned, was not a loud or grand emotion. It did not ride in on a white horse. It was a quiet, stubborn thing. It was the thing that made a man's back ache a little less at the end of a long day. It was the thing that made a woman's hand hold a little tighter to the man she had chosen. It was the simple, steady light you lit against the darkness, knowing that the morning would, eventually, come. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from. So please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, you can give it an extra boost of support by hitting the hype button. We appreciate every one of you.